Anna Corwin. I'm an assistant professor at St. Mary's College of California. My training is in linguistic anthropology and the anthropology of religion, and my research is on health, well-being, and religious experience. My big question is, who gets to say what is real and what is not? I'm an anthropologist, and anthropologists are in the position to encounter humans who are really different from ourselves, which means we encounter systems of knowledge and intelligence that are distinct from our own. And culture has shaped how we understand these different ways of knowing. Global colonial histories have structured the state of the world in such a way that there are some peoples and nation states that have positioned themselves through the forceful acquisition of wealth to be the knowledge creators, the ones in the position to determine what counts as knowledge, what counts as learning, how learning happens, and even what counts as reality. Decentering this narrative is actually quite difficult. And I see two major contributing factors at play. One has to do with culture, and the other has to do with wealth or power. And these two, of course, are intertwined. The cultural element is difficult most simply because we are embedded in it. One of the tricks of culture is that it is invisible to us. Each cultural community has its own way of distinguishing what is knowledge, how we understand knowledge. We each have our own ways of determining what is intelligence and our own valuation practices around this, how we value particular types of knowledge, particular ways of seeking out knowledge. The European American form that is the one that we see in our educational institutions globally, but it just constitutes one model. It's not the only model. It is a cultural model. And the wealth component of this, which we can also call power, is of course entangled with culture. The historical process of colonialism, which has touched and shaped every single one of us on this planet, has prioritized one definition of knowledge and intelligence. Our schools, our universities, our funding agencies are all built within this European American system of valuation. And the same cultural system is the one that has created the types of knowledge and intelligence that are invested in and that are promoted. So this wealth bit, or the power bit, however you want to call it, also means that these historically white spaces are the ones that have had the funds to do the powerful science and to determine what science is worth pursuing. So that leaves us with, first, that there are some forms of knowledge that are prioritized, while other ways of knowing and learning have been systematically disbanded, defunded, decredited, discredited. So this is a problem of ethnocentrism on the one hand, valuing certain forms of knowing. And it's also a problem of unequal wealth distribution on the other hand, that there are other forms of knowing and learning that are not able to propagate themselves for lack of capital. And as we think about this, we could perhaps picture Wakanda, the imaginary world in Black Panther, where African scientists could actually fund novel ways of doing science. And now imagine the Lakota version, and the Mayan version, and the Cambodian version, and the Cherokee version, and the Amazonian version, and the Maori version, and so on. So I'm going to tell you a story now about how this relates to my own research. I work in a Catholic convent with American Catholic nuns. So this is nowhere near Wakanda, but it does connect, I promise. Much of my work has focused on how Catholic nuns' cultural practices have come to shape their experiences of aging. The nuns have this profound skill at navigating care and personhood at the end of life. And this has consequences for their longevity and also their health as they age. And my research has focused on uncovering the social practices that underlie these positive health outcomes. So why do these particular Americans have fewer chronic conditions? Why do these particular Americans live longer? Why are they happier at the end of life? And to be sure, some of the answers to their well-being can be accounted for with some of these happily material correlations that scientists are very, very comfortable with. nutrition, education, lower daily stress, all of these things definitely help. But there is something else that the nuns do that happens in the convent that correlates with their health outcomes. And it's that nuns talk to God. And what I discovered is that for these women, they experience God not in some fluffy kind of wishy-washy theoretical way. I mean, that can happen too. But the more I interviewed, the more I heard accounts of a world in which, for example, they fell asleep holding Jesus's hand, or they hugged Jesus, or they felt God in their very bodies. And this had consequences for their health and for their experience in the world. And as much as many of you might like to interpret this as a metaphor, for the nuns, it was not a metaphor. And for someone like me, trained in the same types of institutions many of you have been trained in, it presents a problem. From a cultural perspective, I'd been socialized into, the way of knowing that I had been socialized into. How could a social scientist consider these experiences fully real, consider this knowledge? First, I hadn't experienced it, even though these nuns were in the room with me and Jesus, their arms quite literally in an embrace with Jesus. I was in a room alone with a nun who looked like her arms were around air. So many social scientists in this situation attempt to bracket God's existence. One can write, for example, about the performative elements of prayer, what prayer achieves socially, linguistically, and this performative lens can be useful through the enactments of prayer and interaction with God. The nuns do seem to have these particular outcomes. That type of writing does a particular job for us. But this performative lens can also be problematic when we're up against such radically distinct ontological claims. And I've become increasingly dissatisfied with the academic trend to downgrade others' experiences to mere beliefs, while reserving knowledge of the world for oneself or the scientists who walk around not hugging Jesus or not admitting to hugging Jesus. So of course, what's at stake is much, much larger than merely the question of a handful of nuns hugging or holding hands with Jesus. And as you know, the Catholic Church has propagated and benefited from the history of colonialism as much as any other institution. So whether I acknowledge their reality is actually of little consequence in the bigger scheme of things. But the world holds a lot of people whose realities are distinct from each other. And when this involves, for example, Indigenous people whose realities have been discounted for generations, the stakes are really high. It's one thing, maybe, to downgrade the nuns' belief in God to a belief rather than knowledge, but most especially when we're encountering people who have been historically disenfranchised, whose inferior intelligence has been used as an excuse to take away land, to force children into American boarding schools, and so on. The question of who gets to say what is real and what is not really matters. But here's where things get a little bit more hopeful. I'm going to suggest that the question is not actually about what is real and what is not. The question is what cultural assumptions got us to this dichotomy in the first place. I think if we can find a way in, we can find a way out. So this cultural assumption, all this sort of my reality, your reality game, is dependent on an assumption that reality is something that is perceived out there, something that is out there in some kind of static way, and is perceived from in here. Out there is reality, the room, the person I'm perceiving, and in here, I am perceiving it. Even theorists who reject representationalism often accidentally recreate this model. This is a cultural framework in which the individual is the node from which a static world is perceived. But if we move our frame from the individual as the perceiver to a frame that includes the perceiver and the environment as a single dynamic interactive system, a whole world of possibilities becomes empirically available to us. And this is a framework that's inspired by J.J. Gibson, and it's one I've been working on in collaboration with a colleague, Cordelia Erickson Davis, who is at Stanford. In this model, we begin with a perceiver environment system. In this model, we get away from Cartesian assumptions of the mind and the body, and it's a fundamentally embodied approach. So in my particular puzzle with my data, that the nuns perceive one reality and I perceive a different reality, if I change the frame, so we are no longer individuals arguing about what is real in a static world out there, to a frame in which each perceiver is embedded in a dynamic system, we can put aside this problem of who's right and instead begin to inquire about the dynamics within each of these perceptual systems, the dynamics that give rise to these distinct perceptual phenomena. When a perceiver and an environment are examined as a single system, and perception becomes a product of direct dynamic interaction within this system, then when a Catholic sister encounters God, God's presence is neither an objective property apart from the perceiver, nor is it a subjective property of her mind projected into the world. Instead, the phenomenon of this perception arises through dynamic interaction within this perceiver environment system. So importantly, the perceiver's history is part of this system. So if you were to replace that nun in the room with me, the perceptual systems would remain distinct from each other. So just as my perception of this computer screen in front of me is a phenomenon that arises as an interaction in a dynamic environment that includes the screen, the light arrays, my retina, my neurons, my particular position relative to the computer, as well as my particular embodied history. If you were to replace me in this system with someone else, another person, or a bee, or an animal, the perceptual phenomena that arises would be different because of the distinct embodied history that the individual would bring to that perceptual system, that would arise within that perceptual system. By decentering the individual as perceiver model, we can begin to inquire empirically about phenomena we haven't experienced ourselves without discounting it as mere belief in a subject's head. What this also reveals is how profoundly our own cultural histories shape our ways of knowing and our ways of discerning what is real. It is our European American knowledge traditions that produce this myth of the individual perceiver that is not always already dynamically embedded in the world. But if we unmoor ourselves from these cultural assumptions and change the frame, then perhaps it's not a problem of your perceptual reality and my perceptual reality, but rather a question of two dynamic systems in which different or similar perceptual phenomena are afforded. So if we ignore culture, we cannot see how cultural processes are constraining or informing our ways of knowing, our processes of learning, and what we count as knowledge and intelligence. As theorists and scientists, we must remember that cultural patterns shape what we see as knowledge and intelligence, as well as what we are able to consider to be real. And when cultural ways of knowing are imbued with power and authority and capital that determine our education systems, our ways of doing science, our funding sources, it's even more important to critically examine the taken for granted assumptions that are shaping what is deemed real and who gets to say so.